Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. As a reminder, the Responsible Edge is a show about business practices that not only achieve results, but do so with integrity. So on today's show, I was delighted to be joined by James Skirrow. James is head of customer sustainability at the sustainability startup Futureproof, where he leads clients towards a more sustainable future by leveraging the software platform coupled with expert support in all things sustainability. So had a fantastic conversation with James today, really focused in on an article from Forbes looking at retention strategies and how to engage with Gen Z employees to ensure that they stick around and provide organizations with as much value as possible. So we dived into some ethical and responsible ways to approach retention, which was particularly interesting. James also had some really good advice that he would have offered to his younger self, so check that out too. Just want to say a big thank you again to James for joining us today. As always, if you've got any thoughts or questions, comments, etc. for James or for ourselves, please feel free to reach out and get in touch. Enjoy the show. James, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I understand from our little preamble there that this is the first podcast that you've done.
Is really indeed pretty nice.
You'd be nice. You'd be nice to me as a very limited in terms of experience host. I always feel like guests are sort of gently taking me through the process of hopefully not making a total fool of myself in terms of hosting. So hopefully that will be the case again today. But thank you for agreeing to give us some of your time.
No, it's brilliant to be here. Thank you for having me. I've seen a few of the podcasts you've run so far. So yeah, I'm honoured to be a guest, and for it to be my first one is really exciting.
Excellent stuff, mate. Excellent. So James, as you'll know, having sort of listened into a few of our shows, always keen to kick things off by kind of giving our listeners, a real flavour of you and your background and what sort of led you to I guess connecting with us and coming on the show. So yeah, just as I mentioned to you in our preamble, like some people go back to the sort of the very beginning. Just give us a flavour of your background and experience.
Yeah, for sure. I might not go back that far. I think probably the best way to go is maybe towards the latter end of my education. So just in terms of my focuses and my interests, I was relatively analytical kind of growing up at school, enjoying maths and that sort of thing. And then also really loved art. So while everyone was on their gap year in some Far East Asia country, I was actually doing an art foundation course to learn more locally around different art formats, and then went over to a degree in accounting and finance, which is very different. Realized I didn't want to do a career in either of them at the end of it all. And I stumbled across advertising. I thought that was a pretty cool space to be in that balanced the level of creativity and analytics. And joined fresh out of university a grad scheme at a company called Good Stuff, and really loved it there. That was where I found my foot. It was a media agency, and I got to work with some really cool scaling up clients. Our focus was, my team was e-commerce focused. So that was where I really started to get involved in advertising and understand more around what people were trying to do with advertising, from the direct sales standpoint or the brand building standpoint as well, and being involved in some seriously cool conversations. COVID was a big impact on a lot of people. I was one of the people in the company that wasn't furloughed. And as a result, being a manager at the time, actually freed up a lot of doors for me. So I got the opportunity to be involved in a lot of conversations that otherwise I wouldn't have been in. The bums on seats rule was a typical thing. You only want so many people in a call if you're in a meeting room, whereas actually being online, you could have your camera off, be on mute, be a fly on the wall, and actually learn a lot more. As a result, I got in some really interesting conversations, and that really started to inspire me into the world of sustainability. I did a couple of units at university around corporate social responsibility, so I had an idea about it. But I came across an article around rewilding, had a company that worked in the forest, pitched the idea around kind of rewilding to them, and it kind of spiraled from there, my interest at the time.
Sorry, James. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. When you say, just so that I can see the timeline of events, this was with the media agency. You had an opportunity.
Yes, this is all in the media agency itself. Okay. It was, they were great there, and they allowed you to kind of run with certain ideas. And one of the clients, I was talking to a very senior member in the team there, and I thought, well, actually, there's this idea around rewilding that's something potentially you could look at doing. So we pitched an idea, you know, it didn't kind of come to any fruition, but that kind of saw my light around sustainability. I started then asking questions internally around what were we doing. Turned out, as most media agencies, there wasn't much going on. It was like, we care, we just don't know how to show it. As a result, I found myself sitting on a advertising industry board, the IPA Media Climate Charter, with very little experience, sitting alongside some amazing people, and it kind of spiraled from there. So for those who don't know, within the advertising space, you've got the Ad Net Zero movement, which is the transition to a more sustainable and just advertising industry. Part of that is kind of split into 5 steps. One focuses on media agencies and what you do with your campaign. So that's where I kind of was putting my focus and putting my time into. And it was great, really enjoyed it. There was some really cool insights coming out around, like, how do you calculate a campaign itself? You know, the language that's being used, or although the more responsible marketing was focused on kind of more the creative industries, because they're the ones as well coming out with the content and all of that copy. And I loved it so much that actually I, you know, wanted to transition over. I was enjoying it more than the day job, which was the planning of the advertising campaigns. And since then, we started engaging with Futureproof at the time. Tom, our CEO, was kind of leading what was on Notion at the time, just a way of helping companies become more sustainable, focusing on B Corp primarily. And then I transitioned over. We were building a platform at the time. And since then, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I know, Charlie, we've connected a lot already around the beautiful world of startups. But at Futureproof, it's been amazing. I've then been able to focus all my efforts on sustainability, part of which has been looking at how do companies, you know, focus around the ethical marketing piece, but also our topic of conversation today is around people and the retention side of it all. And sustainability is incredibly broad, and that's what's super exciting, is you've got this E, S, and G, and part of social is people, and it's all kind of spiraled from there, really. So I guess in a bit of a nutshell, without going back to my birth, that's how I ended up here today.
That was, James, that was yeah, it's so interesting how different people choose to approach a sort of an introduction to themselves. Some are very short, some are very long. That was almost like a perfectly sort of detailed and lengthed introduction. I'm going to ask you a bit of a personal question. You mentioned about you know, art and maths being, you know, or analytics being kind of 2 kind of key passions that you identified as a younger man. I think it's always interesting to hear about how, like, those initial passions that people identified in their lives, like whether or not they're still at play in people's lives as they develop their kind of professional career. Are you still involved in art and that sort of side of things?
No, thank you for asking. Not so much the art side, although COVID, I definitely there were a couple of paintings going at the time. I'm a slow painter, Charlie. Okay, I like my oil paints because they don't dry quickly. Okay. I think it's finding the time for that. But I think maths has been very kind of, you know, it translates really well to a lot of the stuff we do. So measuring carbon footprints and all of that sort of has been, you know, pretty helpful. I'm quite a whiz when it comes to an Excel sheet. Although we transitioned to Google, that was a learning experience in itself. But I think the creative side with art is it's not just the kind of the outcome, but it's more like the approach to something and the ability to think slightly differently, or, you know, problem solving is a big part of art, where you make a mistake, you need to quickly patch over it. And the thing I like with maths is a lot of it is showing your workings. So it's kind of the balance and the structure of both of those is something I definitely use a lot. But unfortunately, I'm not producing any more Van Goghs, as it were, or Van Gogh. Proper pronunciation.
I love the fact that anymore. I'm sure there are some James Skirrow masterpieces.
Yeah, the special ones. I've won an award or 2 in my time, John. Although it was a small award, so I'm not sure it counts.
Well, that I mean, we do your bio and introduction at the end of today's conversation. We'll certainly be talking about our award-winning artists that we managed to snaffle and get onto the Responsible Edge. So yeah, we'll and obviously if there's anywhere where anybody can see any of this art, you know, we can plug away as well.
Oh no, that's all personal. That's too personal for me. Although I have got it on LinkedIn, self-employed painter. So if anyone wants a commission, it will take a few years, but I'm your man.
Very good. Very good. Well, I just want to ask one more question on your intro. You mentioned, am I right in thinking that, sorry, the media agency's name was Good Media?
Stuff.
Good Stuff. So you were working at Good Stuff and then engaged with Futureproof initially as a client or as a supplier?
As a supplier.
Okay.
So yeah, they were helping us with becoming a B Corp or working towards the B Corp framework.
Okay.
That's how I first met Tom. And as a result, we started working together. I really loved that side of it all. He had a job offering going up, and at the time, my colleagues were aware that I wanted to work more in the sustainability space. So it was, happenstance and a bit of luck. But you need that along the way, I think, to move anywhere in your life.
Yeah, nice. Okay, well, that's really helpful. And out of interest, did you go through the entire B Corp certification process for Good Stuff, working in collaboration with Futureproof, or did you move to Futureproof before all of that work was sort of complete?
So move to Futureproof. I think part of the B Corp process, especially for organisations of that size, is it does take a long time. As well with Good Stuff, they actually got acquired by a network called Stagwell. So as a result, there's a lot of moving parts. So larger organisations take a lot of time. So actually, I now have the beauty of them being a client. So I still get to speak to the lovely Sarah Donovan over there. It's my main point of contact. She heads up the people team. So yeah, I still get to touch base and go into their office every now and then and see some old colleagues. So it's a perfect win for me, I'd say.
Perfect. Well, that's the way to do it, isn't it? It's coming out of the old relationship and having a very amicable split to the point where you're still good friends, essentially, isn't it?
100%. Not the whole we're friends and I'm never seeing you again. And I get a panic attack if you walk by me. It's different.
Very good, very good. I don't know. We'll leave that analogy there now. I think let's press on, and that might be another podcast series that we might produce at some point. James, you've kind of touched upon or alluded to kind of the nature of today's article that we're going to sort of focus our initial conversation around. Obviously, it was in Forbes, but perhaps could you just give our listeners a bit of a flavour as to what the article covers and any particular kind of reflections that you had when initially reading it?
Yeah, sure. So the article itself, I've got a couple of notes here because my memory's not that good. But it's looking at how employee retention strategies impact the organization's culture and communication, both internally and externally. That was the main focus of the article itself. And a big part of that was focusing on the growing presence of Gen Z. So Gen Z by 2025 will represent, I believe, a quarter now of the UK's workforce. So a significant portion of the workforce itself. What we have seen, trends, not just with Gen Z, but also a proportion of the millennials. And for those who are unaware, Gen Z is between 1997 and 2012. So we're looking at, that sort of portion. So people around the age of 25 to 18 sort of thing coming into the workplace. Now, there are a couple of things that came out through the article itself. It was looking at the level of high turnover rates to start with. So some pretty incredible stats around people job hopping. One thing that I kind of really took away from it was 75%, and this was by who interviewed them? Resume Builder looked at Gen Zs and millennials, and it was 75% said in this survey response that they would work with a company for up to 2 years and then they would move on. And that's not a case of that company being bad or anything like that. That was just their approach to work. So what we're seeing is this level of high turnover rates, which people are, from older generations typically weren't with. Speaking to members of my family, my dad is coming towards the latter stages of his career. He's been at 2 or 3 companies, each time spanning decades. So it's a very different approach to working, and because of that, it's very costly for employees as well to keep hiring new talent, and that level of retention becomes really important because also it becomes cost saving, as well as learning and keeping all the talent in house as well.
James, so that was, by the way, that was a brilliant synopsis. And I actually, you've clarified a few things that in the article I was thinking to myself, not sure. So thank you for that. Question for you though, on that 75% specifically, we're going to go on to talk about strategies for improving retention rates. But essentially what we're identifying there is regardless of your intention to retain and the things that you can implement in order to retain your talent better, the reality is that these younger people are just working in a different way. And regardless of how good of experience they're going to have, they're going to want to move on. how do we, I know we'll go on to talk about retention strategies as well, but how do we like adapt as organizations in order to sort of account, if you like, for that now just being the way that young people want to engage with their work?
It's a great question. I think it comes down to the sort of work you do to start with. So how important is it to keep someone and ensure that they can grow within the company? Obviously, we talked around that cost saving elements as well. But if there's benefits of, if you've got long-standing relationships with clients, actually having people there for the longer term as well is very beneficial for that. So in terms of what we can start looking at, I would say it's more focusing around, like, we do a thing called a materiality assessment or understanding issues, but it's lots of things that companies can do to just start understanding, how are people feeling about it, whether it be like an employee satisfaction survey or, an exit interview, why are you leaving, learning about what could we have done better to keep you, all of those sorts of things, just to start learning at the minute, rather than, starting off with a blinding strategy and a brilliant bit of paper of like, this is how we're going to keep people for the rest of their lives here. It's more focused around, like, why are people leaving? As you alluded to, potentially this is just a way of working. People want to be moving around jobs, especially with the flexibility, the level of working from home, where you can start a new job having the same office space. I've got a different laptop now, right? It's not impacting my life. My salary changes. I still don't need to go anywhere. I'm meeting new people all the time. It's not a significant change to going 5 days a week from one town to 5 days a week in another town sort of thing. So I think we need to be cognizant of that, but it's more just learning around how important is it for us as a company to be keeping this talent, and why are they leaving? Those are the two kind of key starting points, I guess, to understand the benefit of retaining the talent.
And I want to pry into that as well, but let me just ask, is there almost like again, I'm spitballing here, we might well edit this out, but if we acknowledge that people are just like, regardless of how good an experience we provide, like they're going to be looking to move on, and I guess that just it becomes something that we accept. Is it about us as organizations starting to think about, like, how are we going to then, understanding that we've got them for a couple of years, how are we going to make sure that we develop a mutually beneficial relationship within that period that means that we get something, a key outcome essentially achieved by bringing this person on board, and ultimately we help and support and develop this person so that they can then make that next step? Is it almost about like us rethinking, well, we're not just going to be able to sort of turn the tide on this, but accepting that this is the way that these young people are going to work? How do we work with those conditions essentially? Is that a key kind of thing to think about? Like, how do we train quicker or more efficiently? How do we onboard to the point where we're getting them achieving the outcome? Maybe we need to be more specific and clear about the intended return that we're looking to realize with that person within that timescale. Are there any of these kind of themes that you think, am I rattling on and chatting nonsense?
No, I agree with you there. I think it's definitely around, if we're going to maximize value for both parties, from an individual coming into a new role, you want to be learning as much as possible. You want to maximize on, the benefits that are on offer as well, and develop your career further. So I think definitely the onboarding process is really important, and also the employee review process. I loved it in my old job in particular. There were a lot of you had a long review process. It was very clear in terms of progression. You'd have the job description above you, what sort of things you need to be hitting. And I think a really big thing also comes down to the sort of line manager relationships you have as well. And it's this is really difficult, right? But it's trying to generate a relationship where there is a level of openness and clear discussions. Like, it's not a bad thing to talk about your career development. It's not a bad thing about talking about moving on or pursuing different interests as well. So if you can have those open conversations with people, it then enables the company to understand, like, this person realistically isn't going to be here for another year. So how can we then ensure that they still benefit here? Potentially we look at not necessarily hiring someone else, but restructuring slightly to enable that person to move on as well. But it's that level of communication that is really tricky to do. It's not something, that person has to feel comfortable to say, look, I'm looking to move on here. I remember when I handed in my resignation, I was really sad because, I didn't want to leave the people. The people were great. It would just have very different interests. But that element as well is important, because if you can start communicating about it, then you understand, okay, we can start assessing as a company the sort of frameworks that we need to be putting in place with that person moving on, and planning as well. So at the end of the day, the client, the person we're making money from, is not impacted in any way, because that's the last thing we want to happen, because we need to function as a business. Yes, we want to keep our people happy, but at the end of the day, if people aren't paying us, then it's really hard to keep our people happy. So it's striking that balance as well.
That's super interesting, James. And just on that, like we've spoken before on previous shows about like this notion of like, and I don't think it necessarily applies, but the notion of like corporate vulnerability. Like the reality is being an organization that's like open and to the fact that you're especially these younger, more junior members of staff, like there is an opportunity that the likelihood is that they're going to want to move on, just in terms of the way in which young people look to approach their careers these days. The main thing to first do is essentially get over that as an organization and begin to accept that is just part of the game, and that almost you want to create a cultural environment in which young people feel comfortable to, as you say, have conversations with their line managers, talk about their ambitions, their intentions, etc., and for there to be that kind of transparent, open dialogue between authority essentially within organizations and more junior members of staff. That facilitates an easier way of, as you've alluded to, growing and developing a team and a culture that facilitates your commercial outcomes, but also supports the young people that are working for you. Is that a fair synopsis?
Definitely. And I think as well, if you create an environment where you have that level of openness, at the end of the day, I know I left and it wasn't necessarily for me, but I really valued my time there. I had great relationships there. In my old company, used to have boomerang employees where they would leave, go pursue something else, pursue a different interest, and actually come back because they enjoy their touch. So I think that really highlights the value of it, saying, look, we know you're not going to be here for that long, but you might come back as well. So it's always bearing that in mind. So how can we ensure your time is as valuable here? As you look at, the other side of it, or the financial sector, I think auditing is the key one, where it's like, someone comes out of a grad school, goes there for 3 years, get their ACAs, they do the auditing thing, and then they go get another job because all of a sudden they've got this qualification, they get paid loads more money, and they don't have to do more auditing. That's like, so I think probably learning from that industry as well, of they know a lot of people leave. So they just have this continuation of just getting more and more people in at a grad level from there as well.
Fascinating. And when and again, I know we spoke before about, talking about Futureproof and obviously the work that you guys do, but I think it is that some of this stuff is just so aligned. It'd be great to kind of begin to peer into the work that you're actually doing to support your clients. But how do you, when presumably retention of staff is something that, your clients have come to you with as a key issue and something that they want you to help them address. Like what's like Futureproof's kind of, pitch, if you like, to enable and support organizations to manage their people better?
Yeah, no, in terms of the approach that we take, it's very much like an understanding of what's going on. So for those who are aware, Futureproof, we're not your kind of sustainability consultant. We're actually a platform. So we're a SaaS platform who have levels of support. So my role within Futureproof is head of customer sustainability. The typical platform model is you have customer success. Well, we acknowledge that you'd need someone not just to onboard you, but to also help you understand how you implement certain things. So I bridge the gap between the sustainability consultant and the customer success individual there. What we would do to start with, to understand, like, is this a significant issue for you, is doing things like materiality assessment. So what that does across sustainability is it's plotting what the certain issues are that exist within your industry. If you had to start a company tomorrow, not just what are the red flags for you right now. So we're understanding already, talent and culture, people and belonging, all of these sorts of things might be coming up. And then we understand how much of a priority they are for you to be addressing as a company. We're also understanding within a baseline perspective, what do you have in place? What policies do you have in place? Do you send employee satisfaction surveys? Do you have exit interviews? All of these things, again, we're tracking, and then we put into our back end to work out and build a roadmap to say, look, you're not doing this stuff. Here's how you go about doing this stuff. And then also getting them to track key metrics over time. For a retention perspective, it's looking at attrition rates. Employee satisfaction, it's looking at how happy people are, or NPS scores on how likely they are to recommend someone come and work at this company again. So once we start getting those numbers in, it's then monitoring those numbers. And we get the companies to monitor those numbers through a variety of trackers and systems we have in place. And then they can start seeing, well, are those numbers changing? And if not, we then start reviewing why not, because they're going to be shown in the satisfaction surveys, or they're going to be shown in the exit interviews. And then you take the feedback and then you put it in again. And all of a sudden you start seeing the numbers move up. It's an oversimplified view, but that's the approach to take. And I think we overcomplicate a lot of things. Sustainability is definitely one that's being overcomplicated with a lot of regulations and rules that come in. But at the same time, it's, if you can start measuring things, like putting numbers to things, and then, you trial things, at the end of the day, we both work in startups. It's a lot of test and learn to understand what is going to move the dial. There isn't going to be a perfect strategy. If there were, we'd have it on our system, to be perfectly honest with you. But it's more a case of what's relevant for your people. If you're employing a certain demographic of people in terms of age group, or they might be parents, so they require a different level of flexibility to the likes of Gen Z. So it's understanding as well the sort of makeup that you've got within your team and what's going to keep them engaged for longer.
And I'm interested, by the way, again, that was an absolutely, as expected, a sensational introduction to Futureproof. Let me ask you this. In terms of the article, the Forbes article that we looked at, obviously, I think there were like 5 recommendations that were made around different strategies that organizations could take around training, around like promoting carefully, around like other like onboarding processes, etc. Would you almost sort of propose that there's almost a 6th key strategy, which is getting analytical, which is, I think, what you were just essentially encapsulating?
Yeah, I would say so, because at the end of the day, you don't really know if any of those are working if you can't track numbers. There are a few things as well. They talk about like flexibility as a necessity was another thing that came out. But actually, in the UK itself, start of April, they've introduced new flexible working policies by the government, which essentially means you can require flexible working from day one, or you can request it. It's not an obligation for a company to give it to you. And also, whereas before it was after 6 months of working at that company. So it becomes a little bit more flexible. But yeah, looking at the article itself, there were some amazing stats. There were some good ideas, but at the same time, there was no way of understanding if any of it's working, because you're not measuring anything. So it's definitely having a bit more of a gauge on the key metrics as a company. And smaller companies will be, well, do I really need to be doing this? But if you want to scale and if you want to grow, then starting the metric system now becomes so much easier, because you've already got a system built in. Whereas large organizations who aren't doing any of this stuff, it takes so much more time for them to build it in as well. So if you're listening to this and like, oh, I've got 10 employees, you need to think, well, this is still important for you to be doing.
And out of interest, James, on that point about kind of retrospective retrofit, if you like, of your organization to like input this stuff, like you mentioned there before about the analytical, like within the startup experience, you have that kind of testing hypothesis and testing methodology, kind of scientific analysis, to tweaking little tiny things, etc. Do you think it's almost like when you're thinking about larger organizations, it's almost the lack of kind of the size enabling or allowing for that kind of process to be easily done, if you like, that is the benefit to starting this stuff when you are smaller, because you can adopt more of that sort of testing approach to the way that you evolve and develop your business and the way you operate, not just in terms of people, but other aspects too. Is that the crux of why people should be getting in touch with Futureproof as soon as possible?
I mean, yeah, of course you should be coming to us to learn more. And I think we see these learnings as well. So we have a range of companies, from founder-led companies who are under 10 employees to companies in the thousands of employees. And we see the difference in terms of maybe the resource that a larger organization can apply to certain things. And you might have specific people that sit within sustainability and people teams. But the issue there, as you alluded to, is, it's moving a really large ship. It takes time. And the reason it's taking time is they've got to draw up strategies. There's got to be different communication routes to different teams. You've got to maybe train certain people up. You've got to get board approval, or boards meeting every quarter. They want to talk about certain things, so it might not even make the agenda, for example. So sign off takes ages. Whereas if you've got a founder-led company that's a bit smaller, the ability to pivot and learn quite quickly is really important. And again, mentioned that talent is an expensive thing. So if you can keep your talent pool, the better for your organization. So founders are really keyed up on that element and really want to make sure that their people stay happy. especially more kind of purpose-led companies as well that are looking to balance people, planet, and profit. So it becomes a lot easier to start implementing things. And also, you don't need to have like a special format. You know, you can send a Google form. You can say, oh, you've got Microsoft, you send Microsoft form, whatever it may be. And you can sit down and go through the learnings. You don't have to have a HR individual to do that. You can get a couple of people that are interested in helping people develop, and you can do that together. We work with companies that don't have HR teams, and we work with companies that do. Both parties, there's no right or wrong answer. So yeah, it's a lot easier to do it if you are small, and I'd recommend to start as soon as possible. But at the same time, large organizations can do it. It just takes a little bit more time.
And then in terms of speaking specifically about retention, is that one of the key kind of pain points that you have clients sort of or prospects coming to Futureproof with, that they want to engage with you guys to help and support them to improve employee retention?
From an employee retention standpoint, I wouldn't say it's like the guiding point where we get companies coming to us to solve that problem. Typically, they come to us to solve more holistic problems, or I think sustainability, there's definitely a level of education that's required, because it does encompass, people within your organization, as well as the environment, your supply chain, the governance and the transparency you have, your customers, all of these sorts of things. But what we do see with companies that do take it seriously and achieve certain certifications like B Corp, or are able to communicate authentically about what they're doing, whether that be an impact report. We have a sustainability page that it just helps promote the transparency that you do as an organization within this space. The feedback we get is, all of a sudden in the interview stage, people are like, oh, I really love that you're a B Corp. Or, they've already kind of done a little bit of reading and people are understanding this a little bit more. At the same time, certain certifications like B Corp, I think they've just hit 2,000 in the UK. That's an epic number. It's definitely more of a hockey stick growth. You've got 5.5 million companies in the UK. So you don't have to be a B Corp. It's just being a bit more transparent. I know we've discussed before around impact reports and how that is an amazing bit of marketing material. Don't put fluff in it, but at the same time, it's a great opportunity to showcase a bit more around what you're doing. You've got some brilliant people stories that you can have in there. So as an individual coming into, firstly, understand if you want to work in the company, you can understand a little bit more around the life of the company itself. What happens with people? How do you start engaging with your local communities, or the success stories of certain people? And then the other element as well is that celebration of people who exist in that organization. So all of a sudden they're in a report. You're never going to be in a financial report, but you're in this nice glossy, report that the company's published as well. So it tells a really nice story to both current employees and prospective employees.
It's super interesting. And just so that we're absolutely clear, like Futureproof help support your clients in developing those impact reports and ultimately producing, those kind of materials that can then ultimately have an influence on engagement with the organization's people.
Yeah, we're in terms of the platform, I appreciate we've touched on different topics today. We're an incredibly broad platform. So we've taken, I think might be worth mentioning. Yeah, so if we talk around the UN and the way that they approach sustainability, they've defined the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 of them, you can go and search them online, and each country tracks to them, including the UK. So there's actually a live feed of it. That's how ESG has been developed. It's taking those 17 goals essentially and understanding how as a company can we start relating to these sorts of things. Now, companies not going to be able to do all 17 or anything like that. And there's different approaches that companies can be taking, but the broad perspective is it's just a hell of a lot of stuff you need to be doing. The B Corp framework is something that highlights that, but we effectively split it into 6 sections. You've got governance, employees, suppliers, customers, community, and then the environment. So those are 6 areas that sometimes have departments, sometimes don't, that companies should be focusing upon. And what we do is we help with all of those elements. So we'll provide resources and templates, help you track key metrics. We've got certain management systems that will measure your carbon footprint or map out your supply chains, ESG, all of that sort of stuff. And then at the end, it's helping publish and tell that story through, automating the process as much as possible. 1, it makes your life easy. 2, it avoids you putting fluff in, which is, fundamentally what greenwashing sometimes includes. Charlie, you're the expert when it comes to greenwashing. But what we typically see is just a level of uneducation around it, where no one's deliberately doing it. Most of the time, you're just saying something you probably shouldn't say, or you're overemphasizing something that you already do. And the issue with that is it's now becoming, people are more pushing back on it a bit more. And there's a level of trust that gets lost if you do that. So we help solve that problem as well at the end of the day.
Fantastic. You've given a brilliant synopsis and introduction to Futureproof there. Let's dive back in, because obviously we could do an episode on every one of those six elements, but specifically looking back into the employee, one of those six. You mentioned there about, you get feedback from clients who are talking about the impact, for example, of B Corp and how, in the interview stage, you've got people referencing it, etc. Are you guys sort of tracking that bit of feedback and those sort of understandings of the impact from employee retention at a kind of a future-proof level, i.e. aggregating all of your kind of client feedback? Is that something that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so at the start of the year, we launched a metric system. So essentially within the platform itself, there's the ability for companies to be putting metrics. Now we can anonymize all that data and then start showing trends. So what we get companies to do is we'll highlight as and when you should be reporting certain things. Typically, from an attrition standpoint, ideally report it on a quarterly basis. Satisfaction score actually is probably more of an annual basis. You might want to do, say, little pulse surveys, just give us a score, tell us what you think. And then annually, maybe it's a bit more of a longer survey where there's a lot more written out responses. What we'll do is we'll just be tracking the numbers to start with over time. And from that, we can then understand what people are doing. We can also understand what things have they implemented as well. So inevitably down the line, there's going to be a lot of data that we're going to have our hands on, which essentially shows these companies did this and their scores went like this. And these companies did this and their scores went like this. So that's what's going to be coming down the line, which is super exciting because it's a data-led approach to solving issues like, people and retention and that sort of thing.
I might be pushing my luck here, but based upon the fact that this metric system came into play at the start of the year, have there any initial insights that you can share with us, or are we going to have to wait for the reports down the line?
It's a great question, though. We want to wait for reports because at the end of the day, I think Q1 is a pretty positive time. I know Q4 typically there's a lull in terms of how happy people are, because often it's the end of the year, everyone's a bit tired and they want to have Christmas. So ideally, we want to capture a year's worth of data before we start pulling anything, because we know that there will be fluctuations in trends.
Yeah, that makes sense. And seems very reasonable. Out of interest, when you've obviously, I want to ask about your personal experience of this. I mean, you've spoken a lot about the sort of transition from Good Stuff to Futureproof and how that was kind of, managed, if you like. But you also mentioned at Good Stuff you were managing a team. How large was your team, out of interest?
Oh, so no, so my title was manager. Okay. But it just kind of laid the level of hierarchy within the team itself. So there are a couple of people that would sit under me that were more junior. I never had the fortunate position to be a designated line manager to help someone's career path, because that's something I've really kind of looked forward to do. I enjoy seeing other people excel. That's why I love my job. I get to see all these companies do this amazing stuff. But yeah, unfortunately, I never quite got the opportunity to manage someone.
Well, let me ask you this question then, looking towards the future, what's going to be, both from a personal perspective, but also from perhaps a future-proof point of view, in terms of engagement with employees and in terms of, strategies around retention, etc. What are you guys going to be doing in order to ensure that you hold on to the best talent?
It's a great question. I think one thing that we've done, and I think companies it's important to do, is we set a really clear mission in terms of what we want to achieve as a company and have a North Star that we're heading towards. And essentially that's building a business that is going to benefit the lives of people in the future. It's very broad in terms of our approach. And then we set a series of values that fall under that. So our values is being mission driven. So it's always thinking about how can we ensure that we're making something better. It's them being learners. So always having the ability to learn in this space, in particular within sustainability. It's rapidly growing. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's being entrepreneurial. So it's, our whole conversations came about because, you're an entrepreneurial person reaching out to me saying, I think we should engage around, the responsible climate charter in terms of what you're doing and our position as well. And then lastly, I have jotted it down here so I don't forget itself as well. It's being that team player. So it's ensuring that you can work as a team. We're fully remote as a company. So building that level of culture can be more challenging for remote companies, but it's ensuring that you're always there to support your team members and always keeping base and touching base with people to ensure that they're happy with the work that they're doing. And if there's any way that you can improve what they're doing as well, you can lean in and help with that as well. So that's kind of what we've set up. And then as we grow as a team, it's ensuring that everyone buys into that process as well. And we do that through a vetting process in the kind of recruitment side of it. Also, when we do take on new talent, it's ensuring that people are aware of these and understanding not just their experiences, but more around what their aspirations are, what they want to get out of work. If people haven't really read this and they don't really care about sustainability, they just want a job, that's not the sort of person that we want to take on. So it's ensuring that we find people that we believe align with these values, and hopefully that's a great starting point as well, because yes, we've talked about people not wanting to be here for typically longer than 2 years, but if we can find people that align with our values, then potentially we can egg some time out of those individuals as well.
That's a really interesting point. I think your notion of North Star, I think actually that 2 years thing, I'd love to know that 25% that said that, they essentially aren't saying that they would move on after 2 years without question. It's almost like if you can get the North Star, if it can be that compelling, I mean, really, truly compelling, because I know, we've all got mission statements and vision statements, etc. And I mean, I have to be honest, like sometimes when I read some, I just get so underwhelmed by it being such a regurgitation, if you like, of everybody else's. But sometimes you do come across some that are like, really, truly kind of compelling and have a sort of an activism almost at the heart of them, that think, yeah, like that would be an amazing thing to associate myself with in terms of an outcome. Is that the key, you think, in terms of extending that 2 year period, that if you can get your North Star right, you've got a chance?
Yeah, I think it's the North Star and it's the values that you want to embed. There was a study by Workplace Insight, and they said that 75% of people are willing to leave their job if health and sustainability aren't being adequately addressed as well. So if you can start baking those things in, so the health and sustainability into your values, it doesn't have to be into your North Star, then it's okay. And I think as well, it's having that North Star that fundamentally you probably won't ever be able to achieve. Google's is along the lines of like organizing the world's data or insights or something like that. Like it's fundamentally, to do that is not impossible, but that's the direction they want to go into. Tesla's doesn't mention cars. It doesn't. It's all around the energy transition. So it's having these broad aims and goals, like we're going in this direction and currently this is what's going to get us there, but we're going to work as a company and we're going to evolve and change, and these things will always help us move towards that goal as well. Keeps it exciting for employees, I guess.
Here's my other question on it's an observation that I hope will lead to a question. That's the idea. Do you find, like, I sometimes reflect on kind of like startup recruitment, if you like, and how much easier in a way it is to kind of get those early stage employees on board who like are totally bought into the why. They're like super passionate about like that embryonic kind of sense of like, we're doing something super impactful. And what's my feeling and sense, even though, I've not built a company to the point where we've had like, tens and tens and tens or hundreds of employees, so I don't know this to be the case, but there's a sense to me that it gets harder and harder the further you get away from that kind of startup source to kind of authentically engage with new recruits on that kind of mission. Is that a fair observation, or do you think that it's just about evolving the way that we communicate our North Star and our values to our employees as we get larger that needs to be considered?
It's a really good question. I think that there's two elements that. So I've got the first one around that size, and at what point is it all of a sudden quite hard to have those conversations with everyone in the team, because you've got that spider's web. The more people you add, the more strings of conversation you've got going on. There's a brilliant podcast I listened to, and this person spoke around the boardroom table. And it's like, look, we all used to fit around one table. And I think they got to about 12 employees. All of a sudden, we had to go to 2 tables. You then can't hear what's happening in those other conversations. And that then comes down to culture. Culture being the whole point around what happens when you leave the room, what conversations are being had. So it's embedding that culture. And I think that that's the turning point for a lot of companies where they haven't embedded the culture. You realize it quite quickly at that stage. And then in terms of larger organizations, I can speak from personal experience. Good Stuff they got 6 values and they had them tattooed over the workplace. They had them up the stairs, they had them on walls in meeting rooms. One of my favorite ones is give a shit. The values themselves would be aligned to the awards at the end of the year. They were also aligned with certain review processes the employees would have. So those values were so present throughout the whole time of your experience there that it was hard to ignore them. So you knew what they were. And I think they did a very good job. Obviously, media, advertising, they made sure you saw it all. But they did a brilliant job at it. And I think it's ensuring that as a company, you can showcase those values as much as possible. Whether that, it doesn't have to be, putting on a big mural, but it can be in a review process, or it could be in your work ethic or an onboarding experience, so that people are aware of these values. And, it's just a different way of having to build the culture. And then hopefully, because the employees you've hired beforehand have that instilled, they understand the culture, they can almost teach the people coming in as well. But it's, 2 very different challenges. The first one is like building a culture, and the second, and look, we've got to a level where we just want to ensure that culture continues and builds upon itself. So 2 different approaches on that one.
And out of interest, when you think about, you mentioned earlier that from a Futureproof perspective, you guys are working with, much smaller startup embryonic companies through to much larger entities. Like, how does, in relation to what you've just described in terms of culture and developing culture for the purpose of retention, is that kind of a key part of the work that you're doing? And if so, like, how does it differ in terms of working with, the smaller or end of this size of organization through to the much larger? Give us a flavor as to the sorts of things that you guys are involved in.
Yeah, sure. So I think when it comes down to the smaller organizations, typically there's maybe more conversations that are required to have. So the purpose of our platform is for it to be as self-serve as possible. So companies can take the resources we have, i.e., you haven't got a mission statement, here's how you create one. Here's how you embed company values. Now, where they struggle and they're unsure or they haven't done it before, that's where I come in and I'll lend a hand and just showcase that this is what it actually means for you to be doing. Here's how we can go around implementing it. With larger organizations, typically it's more of like a document review process. It's like, how many times did we write down a mission statement and what did it say? And the amount of companies that will then have different mission statements on different presentations is ridiculous. So it's ensuring, and it's of no fault of their own, but it's because the company's evolved over time, but maybe the documents haven't as well. So it's ensuring that they're always ever present, they're always updated, so that there's no kind of miscommunication going on, or if an employee wants to showcase the mission statement but they're not quite sure what it is, so they've written their own. That's what you don't want. But it's managing those processes. So for them, it's more of like a documentation review, making sure it's clear, and then we push the communication. So maybe they just haven't communicated it that much. And then for them, that's the bigger element, is like we've done our strategy, we've reviewed it all. Our big thing now is to focus on the communication. Whereas the smaller companies, like, actually, let's write it in the first place. Let's work towards it.
And it's fascinating. That was brilliantly summarized. It's that consistent. I was thinking about, when we were speaking before, about like when you get to a larger company, you were mentioning the brilliant work that the guys at Good Stuff did in terms of making sure that those values were ever present. It's the consistency of the mission and the values being crucial as well, because as soon as you experience a sort of slightly tweaked, suggested set of values or mission statements or vision statements, whatever else it might be, like the integrity, if you like, of, well, what are we? Like, why are we here? Like, I'm getting different messages here from the entity itself. So that's an absolutely crucial part of it. Is from the sounds of things, from what you're saying, is that communication is key, but getting consistency in that communication is absolutely paramount to both external and internal stakeholders.
Massively, yeah. If you want the buy-in, you really have to have the same messaging put forward from different parties within the organization as well. And then if you are to change your mission statement, which is absolutely fine to do, it's them not just communicating it, but giving a bit more of an explanation. And it's not a case of we did this workshop and this workshop, and we brought in these sort of values. It's more a case of like, we've changed because our old mission statement was taking us in this direction, and actually we want to go in this direction. And that's fundamentally why we've written all this stuff up. At the end of the day, it's crucial work. We've seen a company that we work with who's done a really big strategy piece, and really kind of thrown out their old mission statement and brought in a new one, and they've communicated it amazingly well. But that stuff takes time, and it's really important to do it well, or else, to your point, it's not going to be communicated effectively. People are going to be a bit unsure. At the same time, that then lends itself to the retention piece. It's like, oh, don't really know what the company's doing, don't really get the direction. I'm going to, find somewhere that's I kind of align with a bit more as well. So again, that's super crucial to communicate, because if you don't do it well, it can then knock on to all sorts of things within the organization.
Fantastic. I love how you've tied it all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, as if I could have done it better myself. Brilliant, James. We've rattled through over 45 minutes of conversation, which I thought sort of anticipated that would be the case. As I mentioned before, always like to finish with kind of a key bit of advice that you would look to have offered your younger self starting out in your career that you think would be helpful and useful to other kind of junior professionals out there.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best bit of advice that I think I could pass someone would just be to be curious. People talk around following your passion. Well, you don't really know if it's your passion until you start doing it. So it's more just being curious. That's how I got into sustainability. That's how I've ended up in the position I am, is just through wanting to try new things and experiment and test and learn as well. That's something I didn't necessarily do when I started university or my job. It was more a case of keep the job and try and get promoted, and the typical things that you think you need to do. Actually, it's the curiosity that has driven my career to where I am today.
James, that's brilliant. I'm going to ask you a question on this. Do you see because one thing that the article I don't think went into, unless I missed it, was whether or not was the justification in the Gen Z's minds as to why they typically move on after 2 years, irrespective of how good a job the organization's done in trying to retain them. Do you think that there are more young people that are adopting exactly that sort of mantra, if you like, that their 20s, their formative professional years are about being curious, learning and experiencing, and that's why, irrespective of the quality of experience they're having at their organization, they want to move on?
I think so. I mean, I'm going to hash. I can't remember what the phrasing is, but our founder Tom, he's got a relation that focuses on kind of a life coach sort of position, and Tom was saying that actually when you do get to your mid-20s, because you've had your career, you've kind of like, oh, I got the job. Parents wanted me to get the job and get out of the house. That's what I got the job for. I didn't really think too much about it. I got it. And then you get to this middle stage where it's like, right now, actually, what do I want to do? And then it can sometimes be, that's why people have big transitions over to different industries, especially in the service-led industry, where there are a lot of transferable skills over, that it becomes a lot easier. So I think as well, it's that age bracket that people are hitting. They're called Gen Z now, but actually, down the line, I think it's like Gen Alpha or something like that. It might just be the decade that you're in. 20 to 30 might be the most popular time for you to move jobs and experiment, because you aren't tied down to mortgages and kids necessarily. That sometimes happens a bit later on. So it might just be a stage of people's career as well.
Brilliant. James, thank you so much for joining us today. If you haven't had a terrible time, we'll almost certainly be inviting you back on for another episode at some point. But thank you for today.
No, thank you for having me. You made me feel very comfortable in my first podcast. I had a great time. And I look forward to celebrating with you guys going forward.
Top man. Thanks, James.
See ya.